Greetings. I am Dr. Graciela Caneiro Livingston, Provost at Nebraska Wesleyan University. I want to welcome you to this year's presentation of Spooky Evenings. We here at Nebraska Wesleyan are excited and proud of this event that brings together scholars, artists, authors, and filmmakers to discuss the topic of horror in its various manifestations across the arts and the humanities. Professor Juan Jose Castaño Marquez and Dr. Matthew Jarvis have been working tirelessly to bring you the best scholarship in the field of horror through this unparalleled digital humanities event. I would like to acknowledge the generous support from the Nebraska Arts Council, Humanities Nebraska, and the Nebraska Cultural Endowment that helps make quality programming like Spooky Evenings possible. Again, welcome and enjoy this presentation of Spooky Evenings.
Tonight on Spooky Evenings, Dr. Hilaire Kallendorf of Texas A&M presents a talk entitled, What Do Werewolves Have to Do with Free Will?
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my guest tonight, Dr. Hilaire Kallendorf. Welcome.
Thank you.
You're giving us a talk on what do werewolves have to do with free will this evening, and we're all quite excited. I guess I could have done the pun of chomping at the bit, or ready for a howling good presentation.
Do you want me to share my screen yet?
Yes, please.
Okay. You can see it fine? Okay. Shall we begin? Excellent. Well, this presentation actually does have a theme song, and I'm going to let you listen to that on your own, but it is called, let's see here, She-Wolf. It's by Shakira. So once you've heard the talk, you should be able to tune in and listen to her lyrics and know exactly why that is the theme song for this presentation. Thank you very much for inviting me. I am grateful to Matthew Jarvis and the Nebraska Wesleyan University, the Spooky Evening series, and all of our listeners. So we'll get started. Previous studies of the story told by Rutilio about his aerial journey and killing of the witch female werewolf in Miguel de Cervantes' Persiles, this is a different novel by the same author of Don Quixote, have focused on recognized sources such as the Jardín de Flores Curiosas by Antonio de Torquemada, or the Historia de Gentibus Septentrionalibus by Olao Magno. In other words, inner texts which contain stories about werewolves. But one of the things which has not been explored enough is the importance of the gender of this female werewolf and her possible relation to the Malleus Maleficarum by Henricus Institoris and Jacobus Sprenger, the most significant European text promoting the witch hunt. This interpretation offers the advantage of tracing connections with another Cervantine witch enchantress, Cañizares, in the Colloquio de los Perros, Colloquy of the Dogs, a correspondence which helps us form a more coherent vision of the Cervantine corpus. Additionally, the return by Cervantes to this thematic material in the Persiles shows a recurring obsession with the perennial mystery of free will. Moreover, for postmodern cultural critics, this episode also presents an unparalleled opportunity to deconstruct the human-animal binary. Finally, reading this episode through this filter allows us to restore it to its original, larger context of skepticism and uncertainty. Let us see how the themes of belief and knowledge and the liminal space between those two intellectual categories are developed in this episode. This is your visual for skepticism and uncertainty. So we have here a story which I want to actually read to you in English translation. Of course, the original is in the archaic Spanish of Cervantes' day. And it is one episode in a Byzantine romance, just to give you the sort of Cliff's Notes version of what is going on there. It has a flying carpet, a witch, a dancing teacher, an aerial journey, a possible murder, which could actually instead be an exorcism. So that's what I am about to read to you here. So let me get to the correct page. And this is actually a 1741 English translation. So I will scroll to that a little bit. Okay, here it is. So this is Rutilio, the dancing master, who is speaking and recounting his adventure after the fact. So he says, I was found guilty of seducing and ravishing a young lady of quality, and in short, condemned to be hanged. Sentence being passed, I was thrown into a dungeon with other criminals before condemned like me, but for much more dishonorable offenses. Amongst these was a woman who passed for a witch and used frequently to come and visit me. She had been thrown into jail for some sorceries, whereof she had been accused. But the jailer had taken off her fetters and allowed her a little more liberty than ordinary upon her promise to cure by virtue of certain simples and charms a girl with whom he was passionately in love, and who was seized with a distemper which puzzled all the art of the physicians. This woman took a fancy to my person, and to cut short my relation, for no story, however good, seems so if too long, fancying myself with a halter already about my neck and ready to be delivered into the hands of the executioner, I gave ear to her proposal. This was that she would restore me to my liberty, provided I would promise in return to take her for my wife. As I seemed to question her ability to perform what she offered, don't trouble your head about that, said she. Do but give me your word to comply with my demand. I will break your fetters this very night, and in spite of the whole world, will convey you to a place where you shall no longer be apprehensive of your enemies. On the assurance she gave me that she would save my life, I no longer looked upon her as a sorceress. On the contrary, she seemed to me an angel sent by heaven for my deliverance. Wherefore, I promised everything she could desire, and waited for night with some sort of tranquility, in expectation of the performance of her engagement. though I had no manner of notion which way. Not to keep you in suspense, after the clock had struck 12 and everything was silent in the prison, she came down to me in my dungeon, and on approaching me, "Get up," said she, "and follow me without fear." Instead of joy, I felt a sort of uneasiness at these words, and it was greatly redoubled when upon rising up, I heard my chains drop in pieces at my feet. I walked after her then without staying to be bid a second time, and found all the gates of the prison open, and the keepers buried in a profound sleep. As soon as we were got into the street, my guide spread a cloak upon the ground, and having desired me to place myself in the middle, "Be of good courage," said she, "and let not fear induce you to have recourse to any prayer." This preface gave me no very good notion of what was to follow, and I began then for the first time to imagine she was going to make her escape with me through the air. However, as my desperate condition would not permit me to go back, the apprehension of a halter got the better of all my scruples, and I determined to comply with whatever she pleased. We seated ourselves then in the midst of the cloak, and as soon as she had muttered some words which I did not understand, the cloak, without any visible assistance, wrapped itself round us and carried us up into the region of the air. Immediately fear took possession of all my senses. I forgot she had cautioned me not even to think of praying, and there was neither a he or she saint whose assistance I did not implore. The cloak beginning then to descend towards the earth, she was sensible I was praying inwardly. "Wherefore have you a mind," said she angrily, "to have us thrown down headlong and reduced to atoms? If you continue to mumble over your musty ejaculations, we shall both instantly be precipitated from the height of the atmosphere." "Wretch that I am," said I within myself, "for what help can I hope if I must not be permitted to ask it of Providence, the only source of all the blessings we enjoy?" I was forced then to cease invoking that holy name and suffer myself to be carried away at the devil's pleasure. In short, in about 4 hours, as near as I could guess, I found myself about daybreak, as I imagined, in an unknown country. "Friend Rutilio," said my guide then to me, "you are now in that place of refuge whither I promised to convey you. I expect you will also be ready to keep your word with me." Having thus spoken, she fell about my neck to embrace me with lust sparkling in her eyes. I pushed her away from me in order to get rid of her odious impudence. When exasperated at my procedure, she transformed herself on a sudden into a wolf, and flew at me as if to devour me. At this sight, fear chilled all the blood in my veins, and my courage quite forsook me. But as it often happens in great dangers that we derive our strength from our very despair, I took heart again, and drawing out a knife, which happened luckily to be in my bosom, I plunged it into her breast. She fell to the ground with the stroke, weltering in her gore, and as fast as the blood gushed out, she quitted the figure she had assumed, and recovered her former shape as she gave up the ghost. Judge how great must be my terror on seeing this abominable creature stretched out lifeless at my feet, and finding myself alone and without a guide in an unknown country. So that is the story that is told within this larger novel. And this again is the title of the novel in Spanish. The story itself is undeniably mysterious. As Michael Armstrong Roach notes, Rutilio's story of the flying carpet and she-wolf is perhaps the most cited evidence for the novel's indulgence in romance fantasy. William Childers, too, expresses puzzlement over what we are to make of these events. He says the fact that we have only Rutilio's word as evidence casts doubt on the veracity within the fiction of these supernatural events. On the other hand, no other explanation is offered for how Rutilio arrived in Scandinavia, and he is undeniably there when he tells his story. Reinaldo Riva goes so far as to claim that Rutilio lied about the whole adventure, and that neither his nocturnal flight nor the alleged case of lycanthropy, werewolfism, ever happened. In the course of the narration, Mauricio, Arnaldo, and Rutilio engage in a fairly erudite exchange regarding wolfmen in England and Sicily, in which rational explanations for their appearance are offered by the judicial astrologer Mauricio. But Ignacio Padilla asks, doesn't the adventure of the talking wolves contradict the dogmatic negation by the old Mauricio regarding the existence of werewolves? So we see that Cervantes' own narrative doubles back on itself in typical Cervantine fashion, producing a verdict which is non-committal at best on the question of what happens when people think they see werewolves. And so Jeremy Robbins is a critic who wrote a book called The Challenges of Uncertainty, and he talks about perception here. He says the question of perception was intimately linked with that of deception. Can we trust our senses and the information they provide, given that we know they do on occasions fool us? And he talks here about distorting factors, including optical illusions. And I thought it would be fun to show you this painting by Hans Holbein, the younger. And if you look very closely, this is the picture I show my students to explain a concept known as anamorphosis or distortion. And that slanted thing that you see in the foreground, if you look at it carefully, it's actually a distorted image of a skull. So we see that the very indeterminacy of werewolves' ontological status played into Cervantes' active and deliberate participation in these broader cultural trends: skepticism, debates about perception, anamorphosis, distortion, that kind of thing. Literary antecedents for this episode are multiple and well recognized. They include Ovid's Metamorphoses, Lucius Apuleius' The Golden Ass, Petronius' Satyricon, among others. The aerial journey as a mode of transport reminds us of the magic flying carpet in Arabian folklore, such as the 1001 Nights. But if we hope to shed new light on an old tale, it is to its theological context that we must turn. With regard to the questionable legitimacy of the werewolf phenomenon, a critic named Ignacio Padilla declares confidently, when the author writes the werewolf episodes, canon law has already denied the physical reality of this concrete type of metamorphosis, explaining it in Augustinian fashion as the product of an illusion, certainly a diabolical one. In other words, the pendulum had swung in the direction of rationalizing interpretation, in line with what Diana de Armas Wilson has termed the medicalization of lycanthropy occurring in the late 16th century. So if actual metamorphoses were not thought to be possible, then how to explain persistent reports of such bizarre occurrences? One answer to the epistemological dilemma occasioned by these alleged phenomena may be found in demonological texts circulating throughout Europe, including Spain, at the time of the novel's composition. Fred de Armas, in an article titled Metamorphosis as Revolt, linked this episode to the Malleus Maleficarum, the late 15th century inquisitor's manual called the Hammer of Witches. He identified two very brief passages in this earlier work as possible intertexts for Cervantes, both of them from the last part of question 10, which is devoted specifically to werewolves. But perhaps because no reliable scholarly edition with English translation was available yet, this happened fairly recently with the 2-volume publication by Cambridge of Christopher Mackay's masterful rendition, de Armas was forced to rely upon Montague Summers' notoriously inaccurate abridged English version from 1928. So perhaps that's why he missed some of these connections. He's a dear friend and mentor, and he wouldn't mind my saying that. So in order to trace these more elaborate parallels, it is necessary to start not at the end, but instead at the beginning of the Malleus Maleficarum, question 10. And the title of question 10 is whether sorceresses working on humans work on humans by turning them into the shapes of beasts through the art of conjuring. The authors give a specific example of this happening. They say, for instance, when a woman is seen as a beast. This happens to be the exact scenario we find in the Cervantes story I read to you. But there is more. The two inquisitors describe the devil's ability to deceive a man's fantasy so that a real person is seen as an animal. They cite prior theologians' view that certain criminal women converting back to Satan and being led astray by the demon's illusions and fantastical images, believe and proclaim that during the hours of the night, they ride on certain beasts, with Diana, a goddess of the pagans, or with Herodias, and with a countless multitude of women, and pass over great stretches of the earth during the silence of the dead of night. It is Satan himself who transforms himself into the appearances and resemblances of different persons. And by deluding in dreams the minds that he holds captive, he takes them on journeys through all sorts of places off the beaten path. Does this sound familiar yet? Institores and Springer go on to elaborate, very often men who are not sorcerers are bodily transported over great stretches of earth against their will. This sounds like an apt description of Rutilio's trip through the air from Italy to Norway. The inquisitors then go on to articulate classical precursors for these transformations, such as the enchantress Circe in the Odyssey, who changed Ulysses' men into beasts. They include a careful caveat, saying this was feigned with acts of illusion through conjuring rather than being brought to pass in reality when she altered the fantasies of the men. It is fascinating to watch the gymnastic contortions the churchmen go through to provide a theologically correct explanation for a fictitious Greek myth. This classical example, however, would not seem to fit precisely the genders of the characters in Cervantes' story. But their next illustration offers an interesting twist. From the lives of the church fathers, Institores and Springer append a story of a young woman who did not wish to comply with a young man who was importuning her for a base act. The young man was agitated as a result of this and had a certain Jew cast a spell of sorcery against her. And when this was done, the woman was changed into a filly. This change existed not in terms of reality, but in terms of the trickery of a demon who changed the fantasy and the sense of perception of the woman herself and of those who looked at her, so that while really a woman, she was seen as a filly. Now, changing the gender roles around a bit, this anecdote could serve as a fairly accurate description of Rutilio's rejection of the witch's amorous advances. But as the one who importunes Rutilio for a base act, why does she morph into an animal instead of him? One answer to this quandary may be found in a subtle theological point raised by the two inquisitors: the ability to see a person deceived by the devil in their human versus animal form was used as a type of litmus test for holiness. In the example above, the upshot is that the woman who appeared in the shape of a filly, when she was brought to Saint Macarius, pictured here, the devil could not work in such a way as to impose an illusion upon his senses as he had others, because of Macarius's holiness. For he saw her as a real woman and not as a filly. And eventually she was freed from that illusion through his prayers. This important detail would explain why Cervantes needed his werewolf to be female. Part of his point in constructing the episode as he did may have been to indict the dancing master, Rutilio, who had seduced his young female pupil on the grounds of moral depravity. using as a litmus test his inability to see the witch in human form. When Rutilio stabs the witch, he performs an act of exorcism, depicted here in a painting by Francisco de Goya, of demonic forces, which then subsequently allows him an opportunity for moral growth. His subsequent ability to see her hideous corpse in human form signals his own transformation and attainment of holiness through ongoing repentance for his sins. The gender of Cervantes' werewolf may bear with it additional connotations, however, since lupa was the colloquial Italian term used to designate a prostitute. The specific context of sexuality is important. Rutilio's story is a painful and imaginative projection of a man's degradation and ultimate isolation through lust. Roger Boas refers to the link between love melancholy and lycanthropy, the transformation of the lover into a wolf. In classical authors, such as Pliny the Elder, not the beer, this guy, and Petronius, in Galician poets such as Macias and Rodriguez del Padron, and in the folkloric traditions underlying the Les de Bisclaveret by Marie de France. The medieval female mystic Hildegard von Bingen wrote that the love of melancholics is hateful, twisted, and death-carrying, like that of voracious wolves. Armstrong Roach offers a historically well-nuanced interpretation of this aspect of the story, which takes into account creative recyclings of classical tradition, as well as confusion over gender roles. He says, there is yet another way of reading Rutilio's tale that does not depend on accepting the novel's marvels at face value. The Roman witch's lycanthropic metamorphosis begs to be interpreted metaphorically as an ethical manifestation of the sorceress's and perhaps Rutilio's lustful character, an approach actually authorized by the Roman historian Livy. Impeccable auctoritas by neo-Aristotelian standards. Livy's example is especially pertinent insofar as Rutilio and the witch are both Italian and engage in a small-scale reversal of the main plot story by traveling from Rome to the north. In Book 1 of his History of Rome, Livy narrates the well-known Roman foundation story of the she-wolf, Lupa, who suckled the exposed infants, Remus and Romulus. Nevertheless, he also reports the view of skeptics who believe that the Lupa refers not to a fabulous she-wolf, but to the meretricious wife of Faustulus, the shepherd who discovered the boys. Lupine in the more scurrilous sense of prostitute. And this is, I apologize for the graphic nature of it, but it is a fresco in Pompeii. Or courtesan, hence the name lupanar, or brothel. This scholar also sees Cervantes' evocation of Livy as a foreshadowing of his own novel's end, where the pilgrims traveling to Rome will encounter a Roman prostitute named Hippolyta. He says, if we are willing to follow this perhaps subliminal evocation of Livy in Rutilio's story of the lustful Roman sorceress as she-wolf, the novel indirectly reminds us that at the vanishing point of Rome's own mist-shrouded legendary past, there stands not only a fratricide, but also a lustful meretrix, another prostitute fresco from Pompeii, preparing the Rome-bound northern heroes for the willful Roman courtesan Hippolyta. Lust becomes even more relevant when we consider still another aspect of the story, namely the potions the witch prepares to cure the prison warden's daughter. A similar substance appears in El Licenciado Vidriera, the Glass Licentiate, a short story by Cervantes, where a Morisco hechicera prepares a love potion for the protagonist. Also in Coloquio de los Perros, Colloquy of the Dogs, where the witch Cañizares anoints herself with an unguent to effect her transvection to the Sabbath. Key to contemporaneous debates over the use of such ointments was the question of whether they could force a person's otherwise free will. In fact, the more we look at this story, the more obvious it seems that the whole thing is about free will. This is the narrative core of the episode. In offering this interpretation, I disagree with scholars who see lycanthropy primarily in terms of divine punishment. Even if lycanthropy was inflicted by God as a punishment, in Cervantes' version, the metamorphosis is gradual enough that those affected seem not to lose all power of volition. Witness this learned disquisition from the mouth of one of Cervantes' characters. Even today, he says, I know that there are on the island of Sicily people of this type, whom the Sicilians call lobos menar, who before they succumb to such a pestilential illness, feel it coming on, and tell those who are nearby that they should flee, or that they should tie them up and imprison them, for if they don't watch out, they will tear them to pieces with their claws. In other words, incipient werewolves feel their illness coming on and still have time to exercise free will in order to avoid harming others. Specific acts of free will are mentioned throughout the story, such as when Rutilio admits, I closed my eyes and let myself be carried away by the devils. With this detailed confession of a decision he made, he is not likely to get away with the excuse of the devil made me do it. Debates over free will went to the heart of disputes about werewolfism, to the notion that the werewolf can transform himself voluntarily through spells and enchantments is always opposed the idea that the werewolf does not have control over his metamorphosis, and that instead it is about an involuntary return of man to his bestial origins. The challenge here is to establish whether the werewolves are authentic servants of Satan or simple victims of a mental illness. So bottom line question is, was werewolfism voluntary? It could be, at least in some iterations, such as the popular belief that certain individuals could acquire by wanting to the homicidal ferocity of a beast by merely wearing a wolf skin belt. But Cervantes' attitude is more nuanced. Nowhere does Cervantes accuse victims of lycanthropy of having brought this evil on themselves. He never condemns them. He doesn't exactly defend them either. His expository passage describing transformation into a werewolf is instead informational, although it contains an important critique of superstition. Cervantes transforms human-animal metamorphosis into one of his most solid arguments for denouncing charlatans and those who believe in them. The forces of evil, he seems to tell us, following Erasmus of Rotterdam, great Christian humanist, cannot disturb the divine order. They can only disturb our senses. Alban Forcione long ago recognized the relevance of contemporaneous debates about free will, specifically Erasmus' De Libero Arbitrio, discourse on free will, or the Canizares witch episode in Colloquy of the Dogs. I would argue that this episode that I read to you in the Persiles is equally grounded in such debates. The two inquisitors, authors of the Malleus Maleficarum, say because sin resides not in the imagination, but in the will, a human cannot sin as a result of fantasies like this that are offered by the devil and of various alterations, unless he agrees to the sin by his own will. The question, of course, is whether Rutilio assents to any sin or not, and this includes the further question of whether his murder of the she-wolf should be considered an exorcism or a homicide. As mentioned previously, one of the oddest things about this story is that the werewolf is female. As this scholar notes in his popularizing of wolves and men, it is rare that women become werewolves. When they do, it is almost always as a means to an end, to steal a child victim for a Sabbath, for example. So here's my favorite female werewolf picture with the red high heels. And here's a witch trying to steal a child for a Sabbath. To make things even more complicated, either the language in the story is imprecise, or there is some confusion as to the wolf's gender. After Rutilio rejects the witch's sexual advances, she turns into a wolf, but the gender of the noun in the text is very definitely male, figura del lobo. Later, however, he stabs the creature, whom I thought to be a female wolf, with the noun appearing in the feminine form. Diana Darmus-Wilson ventures an armchair psychoanalysis of the literary character, drawing upon Freud's famous case study of the Wolfman. She says, in Rutilio's adult disorder, what becomes conscious to his readers and listeners is fear not of the lobo, but of the loba, the female wolf. Rutilio's wolfish, suffocating lust undergoes a striking gender change from male to female. The projection of male lust onto the female, who is then projected as a demonic wolf woman, has rarely been represented with such imaginative power. It is the projection of a repentant Renaissance playboy who knows little or nothing about the women he seduces. Be that as it may, I wish to argue that this werewolf's gender is important also because we are meant to see in her an echo of Cervantes' most famous witch, Cañizares, in the Colloquy of the Dogs. So in reference to Mauricio's disposition on werewolfism, one scholar notes these are the kinds of rationalist explanations for the sorcerer's arts that readers of Cervantes recognize from the witch's tale in Colloquy of the Dogs. Inverting the order of publication of it, but going on the supposition that Cervantes continued to work on and revise several of his works simultaneously over the course of many years, Porcioni notes that the germs for the development of the figure of Cañizares the witch are clearly present in the northern adventures of the Persiles, like Rutilio's adventure we read. Most specifically in Antonio's nocturnal encounter with the talking wolf, and Rutilio's dark vigil over the metamorphosed corpse of the witch who had attempted to seduce him. Although Rutilio's nocturnal vigil is over an actual cadaver, while Cañizares' body only resembles a corpse for the hours during which she goes into her unguent-induced trance, the effect is essentially the same. The narration comes to a halt as the reader witnesses a tableau scene where a witch lies stretched out on the ground as the narrator ponders a mysterious spectacle of evil. It has been speculated that Cervantes might have heard of or even met real-life women accused of witchcraft. Cervantes, collector of folktales, was in a place called Montilla in 1592. There he would have heard of the celebrated witch Camacha, and perhaps would have even met Cañizares or someone who looked like her. Cervantes stayed in Montilla, where, according to popular legend, a group of crones known as Las Camachas had existed and had, among other acts of evil, brought about the metamorphosis of a young noble into a horse. Although it does not specifically mention werewolves, this story does include other forms of zoanthropy, in addition to two boys changed into dogs. This gallery of animals appears as Cañizares describes the effects of the substance witches use to anoint their private parts. Having applied the ointment, apparently we change form and turn into roosters, owls, or crows. We go to the place where our master, the devil, awaits us. Padilla compares the two episodes and concludes, while canine metamorphosis in the work of Cervantes is less an irreparable punishment than a necessary penance, his lycanthropic metamorphoses, werewolfism, are definitive, irreversible punishments. But I think this is not entirely true because Rutilio's girlfriend does recover human form once he stabs her, in keeping with werewolf tradition. In the fiction of Cervantes, a wolf is merely the more ferocious version of a dog. In the Persiles, wolves possess the ability to speak, just like the two dogs in Colloquy of the Dogs. But despite the two stories' obvious similarities, there are also important differences. Ironically, given its dark setting, the Persiles episode ultimately contains more hope for redemption. It might be argued that Rutilio's tale contains glimmering echoes of sanctity, such as the biblical account in Acts of the Apostles when St. Peter breaks out of jail while Roman guards are sleeping. Rutilio's jailbreak scene, we already read it, contains certain common elements with the biblical account. Consider how the Vulgate Bible details St. Peter's nocturnal escape. This is from Acts 12. Peter was sleeping between two soldiers bound with two chains, and the keepers before the door kept the prison. Behold, an angel of the Lord stood by him, and a light shined in the room. And he, striking Peter on the side, raised him up, saying, Arise quickly. And the chains fell off from his hands. And the angel said to him, Gird thyself and put on thy sandals. And he did so. And he said to him, Cast thy garment about thee and follow me. And going out, he followed him. And he knew not that it was true, which was done by the angel, but he thought he saw a vision. And passing through the first and second ward, they came to the iron gate that leads to the city, which itself opened to them. And going out, they passed on through one street. Immediately the angel departed from him. The disturbing similarities between these passages, disturbing because the witch would seem to fill the role reserved for an angel sent from heaven as divine deliverer in the New Testament account, might place in doubt our neat and tidy black and white vision of the witch as incarnation of pure evil. Indeed, Rutilio even refers to her as an angel in the text. He says, I esteemed her to be not a witch, but an angel sent from heaven for my remedy. Another saintly echo for this episode might be from the legend of St. Raymond of Peñafort, who allegedly took a 6-hour journey on his cloak. St. Raymond of the Order of Preachers, being on the island of Majorca with King Jaime the Conqueror, seeing that the king did not want to leave a lady friend he had there, resolved to go to Barcelona. He went to the port, and seeing that they were making ready a ship to sail, he begged the sailors to take him and his companion to the mainland. The sailors responded, Father, we cannot comply with your request, for the king has commanded us not to take you on board. These details having been attended to, seeing there was no option of leaving the island on a ship, he went to the rocks by the marina, venturing to the place where they touched the waves, took off his cape, laid it over the inconstant waves, took his staff in his hand, and making the sign of the cross, embarked on his cape as if it were a ship. He made his staff into a mast, and half of his cape he made into sails. And before sailing, he called to his companion, who watched in astonishment what the saint did. The companion, not really trusting the cape, doubted and did not want to embark with St. Raymond, and so he was stranded. The wind blew, and 6 hours later, he landed on the beach in Barcelona. Rutilio's journey on the Witch's Cape might be aerial instead of aqueous, but other than that, the parallels are striking. So, a similar ambiguity between saint and sinner might be true of the witch in Colloquy of the Dogs. She hides her office of witch behind a facade of charity and devotion. In the tableau scene where she lies comatose on the ground, bystanders from the hospital argue about whether she might actually be experiencing saintly ecstasy. In between ecstasy and exorcism, Alison Weber demonstrated that the same ontological ambiguity shrouded real-life early modern people, even such revered figures as Saint Teresa of Avila, here sculpted by Bernini in the moment of her transfiguration, where the angel pierces her heart. This radical uncertainty has been characterized by Jeremy Robbins, the scholar I mentioned before. He says potential deception of the senses has been seen to be a major preoccupation of the period. The Baroque developed three closely connected notions that helped make the early 18th century receptive to empiricism and experimentalism of the new science. These were the pragmatism typical of political realists such as Saavedra, the notion of utility as expressed by Gracian and Lopez de Vega, and the perceptual scrutiny fostered by the fusion of neo-Stoicism, and here I do not mean this kind, but instead this kind, and skepticism, both of which stress the need for close observation and withholding of judgment. It is impossible to determine whether the witch is a saint or a sinner, and that is precisely the point. We see that the story of Rutilio, likewise, even before his moment of recognition, already contains within it the seeds of sanctity, or at least salvation. These flickers of holiness contribute to the complexity of Cervantes' characters and belie attempts to pigeonhole these witch figures as uniformly, absolutely malevolent. Before closing, we should mention one further twist to this episode, namely that later on, Rutilio finds himself the sole survivor of a shipwreck and comes to a barbarous isle where he is destined to spend 3 years doing penance for his sins. The first thing he notices about this new place is a corpse hanging from a tree. The whole thing, of course, gives him the creeps, but since beggars can't be choosers, he borrows the animal skins worn by the cadaver and decides that his best strategy is to feign an inability to hear and speak. He says, "I took the corpse down from the tree, and having taken off all my clothes, which I buried in the sand, I put on his clothes, which fit me well." And I'm thinking he must have looked something like John the Baptist, for they were no specific size, having been made from animal skins. To hide my native tongue, I pretended to be mute and deaf, and with that trick, I came into the interior of the island. So to Rutilio's self-imposed excommunication, resulting in a human being who does not talk, would have to be juxtaposed the character Antonio's encounter with a talking wolf, which once more places in jeopardy our customarily neat distinctions between man and animal. In fact, their radical indeterminacy might be the most unsettling thing about werewolves. Werewolfism may not be apparent to the naked eye, as in the popular belief that the wolf skin of a lycanthrope grew on the inside, which explained why werewolves did not so much look like wolves, but instead acted like them. This idea that werewolves' fur actually grows on the inside, an extreme example of the Baroque topos of the upside-down world, which in this case turns itself inside out, produces an uncanny sensation of not being comfortable in our own skins. Never just an unfortunate coincidence, werewolfism inherently bore moral overtones. Cervantes turns to the werewolf to posit the problem of evil as a degradation of the person, a loss of humanity in favor of the emergence of our previously contained animality. Man degenerates into animal, and animal is decidedly bad. Or is it? Jacques Derrida's The Beast and the Sovereign is shot through with references specifically to werewolves, derived in part from sources as varied as philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau and psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Derrida cites a telling passage from Rousseau's Confessions, in which he describes himself wandering from one country inn to the next, so unkempt that he might have passed for a werewolf. Derrida goes on to invoke Lacan's explanation of the Latin phrase homo homini lupus, loosely translated as man behaves like a wolf toward his fellow man. Lacan makes his own pronouncement in this regard. The law is always determined from the place of some wolf. He continues, the paradoxical question of what is proper to man ran through everything we said and quoted. I would like to emphasize the way in which the werewolf, the outlaw, as the English translation of Rousseau's Confessions has it, the wolf man as werewolf is identified not only as asocial, outside the political law, but outside the theological and religious law, a miscreant, basically an atheist. The werewolf or outlaw is then without faith or law. Confessions present the wolf or werewolf as someone who basically does not recognize the sovereignty of God, neither religious law nor the church, especially the Christian church, and so is without faith or law. This might seem like a resounding condemnation, but the whole gist of Derrida's argument as he develops it in 2 volumes of The Beast and the Sovereign is in essence to reverse this historical demonization of the werewolf, to deconstruct the human versus animal dichotomy and show how human beings manifest animalistic traits and vice versa. This theoretical trend has continued in recent years with Giorgio Agamben's The Open, Man and Animal, especially as it relates to the concept of bare life. This discourse permeates also the realm of sociobiology. According to Robert Wright in The Moral Animal, scientists have found evidence of such phenomena as reciprocal altruism and what is called non-zero-sumness in animal behavior, whereas previously these were thought to be exclusively human traits. Werewolves, by their very nature, destabilize the human versus animal dichotomy and show us that in the end, these distinctions might be somewhat arbitrary. The supposedly hard and fast boundaries between species could be blurrier than we want to admit. So where does all this leave us vis-a-vis Cervantes? So once again, Jeremy Robbins in this book, The Challenges of Uncertainty, says the Spanish Baroque is marked by a profound sense of individuals exploring their rapidly changing world and the possibilities and challenges this offered. The picture that emerges is a culture vigorously engaged in questioning its own assumptions and beliefs, striving to make the individual reader and spectator engaged in actively exploring and questioning received ideas and ideals. This engagement of reader with text or viewer with canvas, and here I've placed Las Meninas, the famous painting within a painting that I use to show the students meta art, is what makes Baroque literature and art so vibrant. Cervantes did not squander the chance to show himself a bit of a necromancer in the Persiles, if not an outright necromancer, then at least a participant in the seance. Commentary on this episode emphasizes the patent interest on the part of Cervantes regarding the instability of the real. The lure of the diabolical could reside simply in the fact that it provided that ineffable spark, which is the germ for literary creation. And a Christianized version of the neo-Aristotelian legitimate marvelous provided easy cover for an author curious about forbidden knowledge, and that phrase is Roger Shattuck's. A literary technique like perspectivism offered the perfect way out. The character Mauricio explains that the force of enchanter's spells makes us see one thing in place of another. And this is reminiscent of Don Quixote's attributions of his misperceptions to enchanter's spells. Is it a barber's basin pictured here, or the helmet of Mambrino? Is it a witch or a werewolf, male or female, demonic figure or angelic deliverer, incarnation of pure evil or holy saint? The only possible definitive answer must lie in the eye of the beholder. As has been illustrated by this case from Cervantes, Baroque arts of perception will always leave us squirming uncomfortably in that liminal space between belief and knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you. It's really funny because I kept writing, I was giggling because I would write things down, and then about 10 minutes later you would mention it. And it was like,
Great
right, when you were reading, the first thing in my notes is actually Acts 12, Peter. Because it just, so I guess that's a good place for me to begin this end of talk discussion. Yeah, it was the first thing to come to my mind when you were reading the story. I mean, you were probably halfway through that and the story of Icarus and his father. So those were the two that came to my mind.
Flying too high, yes. Having the wings.
But particularly Acts 12 and the arrest of Peter. I don't know if it's just because I've been listening to so many religious talks in the last couple of days. We had Esther Hamori on last night, and we had Brandon Grafius on a few nights before, and he was specifically talking about witches. She was talking about angels, and it's sort of like, I don't know, I'm like shifting these things into a different perspective in my mind, I guess, from these three talks, the way that I'm sort of reconceptualizing different pockets of time, I guess, because you've also bridged the two. Because Brandon started very early Christian and then jumped to representation on film. And Esther was really very textual about what they looked like, what they did, and how horrible they were. And so you've got the middle ground here, which is quite a lot of ground to play in. And you've also brought in a lot of the fiction around it, but also fiction of people living in very religious times. And so I'm wondering, in terms of this is a very long-winded question. I'm wondering, in terms of Acts 12 and the relationship to Cervantes, is there textual evidence, or is there evidence in terms of like that story having some sort of deeper import at that time, perhaps, that would have been inspirational?
So that's a great question. And I do tend to think in terms of inquisitorial oppression, which is all too real. And so the liberation, Cervantes himself was a captive. He was actually a captive for 5 years in Algiers. He was being held for ransom. This is after he fought in the Battle of Lepanto against the Turks, where the Spaniards and Christians in general were victorious. He fought under Don Juan de Austria, who was the bastard brother of King Philip II. In that battle, Cervantes gained a nickname and lost the use of his arm. And so ever after he jokingly called himself El Manco de Lepanto, which of course had to rhyme, which just means the one-armed person, or maimed one. And so unfortunately, he actually was carrying letters of commendation on his person. This is like, I tell my students, I will write you a beautiful letter of recommendation, but do not carry it on your body, because you could end up in a dungeon in Algiers, like Cervantes. That actually was part of the reason why he probably was treated better than the average captive, but also why they held on to him for so long, because they were holding out for a bigger ransom. So his letters of commendation from Don Juan de Austria may have saved his life, but they also probably extended his captivity until finally the friars were the ones who organized, because his family was not wealthy enough to come up with this kind of money. And so the Trinitarian friars, it was a business of captive redemption, but they did manage to collect enough funds and organize his ransom. And that's why he's actually buried in the Trinitarian monastery. And his bones were only located less than 5 years ago. It's amazing. And it was only marked by the initials MC, Miguel de Cervantes. And so I do tend to think that he also had been in actual jail, in debtor's prison. And so, because he had chronic problems with poverty. So probably a story like that would resonate for a man such as this. We know that he most likely viewed the specific painting that I showed by Raphael in Rome, because he did spend time in Italy. And so Frederick de Armas has traced like the specific references to specific paintings that Cervantes makes in his work. So it wouldn't be a surprise if maybe he became interested in the account in Acts through the painting. But that's kind of interesting too, as far as how he got there. But yes, I think it for sure would have resonated just in terms of the basic themes of liberty, freedom versus enchainment, oppression, imprisonment. Absolutely, those would have been profoundly important for anyone living in a culture where captivity was very real, and he was captured by pirates. But also just within his own society, he would have been constantly sort of nervous about the surveillance of the Inquisition.
It's interesting that you bring up the Raphael rooms specifically in the Vatican, because part of what those rooms do as well, one of the more famous pieces of them is, of course, the School of Athens. And part of what those rooms' goals are is to unify secular aspects that would typically be pagan of philosophy under a Christian theology as well.
Yes, and that is the same synthesis that a Christian humanist like Erasmus was trying to effect. And part of the recovery work that scholars such as myself, particularly my dear teacher that I mentioned, Alvin Forcione, was my dissertation director. He was the pioneer with this, of trying to recover this heritage of Christian humanism in Spain, and specifically Erasmian Christian humanism. And that whole thing is very vexed because while he never really wanted to break with the church, Erasmus was first read in Spain with great fervor, and then his books were banned by the Inquisition. So it went from one extreme to the other. And so to recognize that Erasmian Christian humanism permeates Cervantes's work is by definition to say that he was not entirely orthodox. And that's interesting. But he found ways to allow those tensions to coexist in his fiction without getting into too much trouble.
It's interesting too because the end of the story mimics a scene from the Iliad, which is the story of Dolan. I don't know if you're familiar.
And I wouldn't be surprised with all the classical precursors here. It has to be just like a hodgepodge of all these different resonances, all these different echoes, and I'm sure we're meant to hear all of them. It's not supposed to be limited to any one intertext, or in the case of the painting, painting can also be an intertext.
What's interesting to me, because Dolan is like this great betrayer of Troy, right? He betrays Hector, and he dresses as a wolf, and he gets caught by Odysseus. Mm-hmm. And he's brutally murdered after he basically tells them everything, and then they go and ransack everything. But I see a parallel here to this exorcism, shall we say? Yeah. The idea of this purging of in this case he kills the woman, and in the case of Dolan, this purging of one's secrets and being sort of very negative in his representation. And I see sort of a similarity here. And then if I fast forward that, of course, I see echoes of that in a movie like Midsummer toward the end, the same sort of idea.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting too when you talk about the conflation of murder and exorcism, because those were not normally conflated. And in fact, when I studied originally for my dissertation in my first book that you pulled out and showed me that you had a copy, I studied England and Spain. So the people would ask me about the differences between those two during the Renaissance, which happened later in both of those countries than it did elsewhere in Europe. And one of the main differences that I noticed with regard to this material is that fewer witches were burned in Spain. It's counterintuitive. You think, well, Spain had the Inquisition, and part of that is we've bought into the Black legend of Spanish cruelty, which was English propaganda from the get-go, and it still persists. So as a matter of fact, statistically, England burned far more witches. And then you sort of look into that and say, well, why? And part of it was because England had renounced, along with popery and Catholic superstition, all of the ceremonies such as exorcism. They threw the baby out with the bathwater, and they no longer, it left a void, it left a vacuum. They no longer had a way to deal with the problem of evil in its physical manifestation here. So the only thing they could think to do was burn the witch. Catholics had a very effective ritual that even secular psychologists looking at it say, well, guess what? You don't have to believe anything. And you can still study it and see that exorcism works. Now, they might explain it some other way. They might say that with the power of suggestion, if someone believes they're demon possessed and you can convince them otherwise, you've cured them, right? But regardless of how we want to explain its effectiveness, Catholics had that as a weapon in their armory, and Protestants never came up with anything equivalent. And there's a reason why in some Shakespeare plays, for example, Macbeth, King Lear, there are echoes of exorcism rituals, but also of the Jesuit priests in hiding who were still conducting covert exorcisms in barns in the English countryside, because the people were still, they knew that they needed and wanted a solution, and that these priests could potentially provide.
I have to imagine, though, if you traced the Inquisition over time, as it became a more corrupted institution itself, you mentioned Goya briefly, as it got up toward the late 18th, 19th century, because it does go on until the early 19th century, I imagine more people bribed their way out of some charges too toward the end.
This definitely was known to happen. Yes.
Which Protestantism would not allow either. So
there was a rampant confiscation of property. So yes, and so Goya was right at the era. He of course also drew the disasters of war about the Napoleonic invasion by French troops of Spain, and the Inquisition lasted until 1820, I want to say, in Spain, when it was finally shut down by Napoleon's brother, Joseph. So that's a pretty long time for it to continue. From
it was 1808, actually.
Was it? Thank you. So in other words, that's too late for me. I did Renaissance, and so I mean, for it to start in 1480, it had a pretty good run.
Well, that's what I mean. Mel Brooks, right? The Inquisition. What a show. The Inquisition. Here we go. I also was thinking about, we'll go the really way back machine here. We'll go to the 4th century. I was thinking about the Council of Ancyra while you were talking as well, which actually addresses werewolves.
Oh, nice. I'm going to want that.
Yeah. So
what do they say about it?
So it says that anybody who believes, it's two things I want to point out here, because one actually really ties into what you said. It calls anyone who believes in a transformation into another being by anyone but God an infidel.
Oh.
So that's one thing I thought of. But the other thing I thought of that was rather interesting as you went along, and particularly as you got to a psychoanalytic read of it, is that it began to conflate women, specifically women, with leprosy, and having sex with a woman with leprosy to bestiality.
Oh.
And so I was thinking about this sort of like the transformation of the skin and the flesh in this lycanthropy setting, as sort of one of these sort of like taboos that's emergent in the 4th century that may sort of explain the takings forward. Because I was wondering in my mind, like, when did it become a female trait, and then when did it transfer back into a predominantly masculine trait? Mm-hmm. And so the best I could come up with for that was perhaps the Council of Ancyra.
Hey, it's as good an explanation as any. That's interesting that you talk about the bestiality, though, because in Spanish there is slippage of terminology to refer to bestiality in the Inquisition trials. So in the Inquisition trial document, the phrase that's used is pecado nefando, the nefarious sin. It can refer either to sodomy or bestiality. And it's totally you have to just look at the context to even to try to figure out which they're talking about. But that is really interesting about the leprosy. That's a different twist for me.
Yeah, because it conflated those women to being beasts.
Yeah. And I haven't found any cases of leprosy in the text that I was looking at. So that's interesting.
The other sort of like bookend to this, to answer my own question in a way, was Martin Luther, who used werewolves to describe tyrants.
Yeah, that's good. And I tend to think he probably would have been, I don't think he would have been against this reading. Perhaps the one who would have objected would have been John Calvin, because he would have said that predestination trumps free will, and therefore he wouldn't have liked my reading at all. But I don't know that Martin Luther would have had as much of a problem.
You would have been destined to be a werewolf.
There you go.
I also wondered, and I wanted to ask you in relationship to this, because you showed so much art. I'm of course an art historian, so I was thinking too in some of this, particularly in the context of the time, rather than when I would think of it, which would be like revisiting it. But I was thinking about Uther Pendragon and his transformation by Merlin in order to seduce a woman, right? He transforms into Warliath.
Yeah, I mean,
pardon my Welsh.
That's all right. Mine's rusty too. No, the transformations just happen constantly. And one of the things that I just recently found out about Merlin, I didn't know that he was so heavily invested with alchemy, but I also didn't know that he's considered to be one of the Celtic saints, and particularly what's called an anam cara, or soul friend. And I really just had no idea. I was only familiar with Merlin from the Arthurian cycle. And so that was kind of it was a revelation to me. I enjoyed thinking about a spiritual side to Merlin, and the idea of Merlin as saint kind of blew my mind. So.
Well, I mean, it is interesting because Brandon made this point about that witches biblically and how witchcraft was deployed in the Inquisition and then later in the witch hunts, both in England and then later in the United States, well, the colonies at the time. He was making this point that it tended to be women, and it tended to be sort of like drawing a negative power that was not blessed by God, right? So this idea of Merlin as saint is also relatively interesting, because he does get wrapped up in a very Christianized telling of heroism and chivalry in England.
The Grail quest, for goodness sake, right? So yeah, and that seems to go along with the syncretism between the Druids, for example, and these early Catholic Gaelic saints. So that opened a whole new world to me. Now I'm going to be looking at saintly Merlin figures.
I mean, if you think about it in terms of like what you're talking about here, right? In terms of like these gendered creature women, it does sort of like fit, right? Because in some bizarre, twisted way, right? Merlin's casting this transformation isn't witchery. It's like of God, which also goes back to that 4th century Ankara Council, right? It's still God.
Yeah.
And yet this woman then in the Cervantes stories is still drawing her powers from something else, probably nature, and allowing for this to happen. Then she's severely punished essentially by being penetrated to death through a knife.
Mm-hmm. And really it gets down to questions of authority and who gets to define orthodoxy, for example, right? And to what power do we attribute these things? So yeah, that you've given me some good things to think about.
Well, she's also like an archetype of 80s slasher film too, if you really push it forward, right? The evil woman who must be punished. Right. To borrow Carol Clover's thesis, right, from Men, Women, and Chainsaws.
For sure, there is a misogynistic reading possible there.
You brought up Diana as well, who is an interesting figure, right? Because Diana is also technically Artemis. But one of the interesting stories there with Diana, of course, is that Zeus transforms himself into a woman in order to seduce her. So again, another transformation here, but this time toward the feminine.
With ambiguous gender. And yeah, to have her be the goddess of chastity and of the hunt has always seemed a little bit of a perplexing. I mean, of course, there's the whole Actaeon and stag and the bathing, but it still, to me, has just seemed a little bit paradoxical, to have that pairing.
She's a very strange figure anyway, because then later on she falls in love with Endymion, right? And then she has 51 children with his sleeping body.
Yeah.
So, chastity no more, right? It's like
right, exactly.
Like the Vestal virgins, right? When you hit 40, you could go have as much sex as you wanted and be as promiscuous as you wanted, but you had to make it to 40. I feel like that's Diana after a while. Like, I've been the moon for so long. My brother gets to do whatever he wants.
It's not fair.
Yeah.
He gets to have all the fun.
I just have ask more about the Spanish Inquisition in my notes. It's a genius note I have here. In terms of the Inquisition itself, the role of the witch also seems to evolve quite a bit over. It starts in the late 14th century, and then progressing on. They're much more serious about the witch hunt stuff until about the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
They definitely seem to believe a lot more in it, and that's because they can't really understand the natural world, it seems. But how they characterize the witch seems to change quite a lot post-Enlightenment as well.
No, they do. There's so many classical precursors, but also there's a heavy component of anti-Semitism, sadly, because the Jews are accused of doing a lot of same things that witches are accused of doing. And the important thing to recognize about witchcraft is that the devil is thought to be the eighth of Christ. And so everything that a witch does is supposed to be the mirror opposite or inversion of Christian sacrament, Christian ritual. So, for example, instead of the kiss of peace offered during the liturgy of the Mass, which is biblical, greet one another with a kiss of peace, the witches are supposed to kiss the goat's anus, and that's supposed to be the embodiment of Satan. Again, Goya gave a wonderful depiction of this, one of his paintings. They have, instead of the Eucharistic wafer, there's a black turnip used instead. All kinds of different, so the Sabbath is supposed to happen on Thursday night, specifically, the same night as the Lord's Last Supper.
We should have had you on tomorrow.
Well, right, I know. Missed opportunity.
Actually, what's funny? We have it's Heather Green tomorrow, and she's talking about witchcraft on television. So
okay, well,
it works.
Ask her about the Thursday night connection.
Right. I got my black candle, so we're set.
that unless people were very, very attuned to these theological niceties, they were going to sort of miss all of those resonances. And so I think the same would also be true for the different classical precursors, and definitely even the myths of the Bacchantes, for example, the Dionysiac frenzy. these kinds of things really played into the witchcraft legends as long as they were very much a part of popular culture. And once the classic texts had been forgotten, then I think some of those elements drift away, and you almost end up with a less erudite depiction of a witch, and it just becomes the poor crazy woman living in the village who never managed to have babies and is possibly the midwife who's on duty when infants die at birth or the mothers die during giving birth. And then people are sad and they cast around for a witch to blame. So there's very much a sense in which witchcraft and its changing depictions, it's almost like each culture uses the category of witch to project its own preoccupations, right? And its own anxieties. There's definitely a scapegoating mechanism that happens. But I think successive generations do characterize witches differently, partly because their preoccupations change as a society.
You mentioned the horrors of war. I'm curious if you have a favorite of Los Caprichos.
Oh my gosh. I love the ones about teachers, where donkeys are shown as teaching. I actually had those framed for our seminar room because I thought it was sort of self-deprecatory in a healthy way.
My favorite one's called They Spruce Themselves Up, and it's a bunch of demons lounging and they're giving each other like pedicures with they're cutting their toenails.
Oh my gosh.
And it's just so surreal in the series. I mean, there's some good ones in there. Goya, of course, was a cartoonist at the beginning of his career, so you get a lot of this dark humor through it. But that's my absolute favorite, is They Spruce Themselves Up.
Yeah, the little titles, the snide titles it gives them, that's fun too.
The other one that's really good is called There Is Much to Suck, and they have like these crones have a basket of babies, but they also have like the little box of candies. So it's this weird play on that. And it always made me think of when I was a kid in church, the bag of candy that would go up and down the pews, and just people eating the candy. So I thought, Goya may have had a similar experience.
What church do you go to? Right? We don't get candy in ours.
Maybe a Southern Baptist thing, I'm not sure. Let's see. Another song I wanted to point to you as a moment of fun, if you're not familiar, it's a weird country song called Marie Laveau that you might appreciate.
Oh dear, okay.
It's not dissimilar to the one you recommended in terms of sort of like strangeness to it, by Shakira. I thought too about Tristan and Isolde in terms of like the compulsory love potion aspect of things. It's weird to me that people talk about like Romeo and Juliet in these terms, because that's not this weird mystically compelled love, whereas these other stories where a witch compels you to be in love, always in very darkly. I mean, Romeo and Juliet ends kind of dark, I should know, but like it does end very dark, but not like Tristan and Isolde. I mean,
No. The potions in Romeo and Juliet are just to either feign death or, in fact, kill yourself. And so the Tristan. I mean, especially I think of the operatic version, and there was such a market for these things, obviously, at one time. I'm not convinced that it's completely gone. I think there are all these wild sort of websites that offer help to people who, particularly around Valentine's Day, who want to solicit favors from a beloved. But it was very, very much part of the culture. And so that became a crucial sort of factor to take into account, right? That, well, if potions do work and they can force the will, then is the person truly responsible for their actions or not? In the Tristan case, it would be, are they responsible for adultery or not? If the potion was really enough to just completely blind them and create sentiments that wouldn't otherwise have been there, it sounds like a pretty decent alibi.
Didn't work out well for Paris, though, did it?
No.
Doesn't work out for. I mean, Tristan is. I mean, they dissolve into the stars at the end.
Yeah,
like it's truly bizarre. I guess the last thing I wanted to bring up in relationship to this was Jean-Paul Sartre, where all things must end, I feel.
Oh, all right. Nausea? Where are we going with this?
Well, I was thinking of being in nothingness at various times, particularly in the idea of identity and free will. I was specifically thinking about the scene with the waiter, if you're familiar with it, and being in nothingness, where it's just like, if somebody waits on me now and I see them later, is their identity still waiter? And do they have the ability to change that relationship that I have to their identity? Or is that just forever linked because that's how I identify them? And if enough people identify them that way, is that in fact their identity?
I'm gonna have to think about that one some more. Because I'm also curious about the werewolf stories. The creepiest to me, I mean, of all the creepy images that I saw and that I showed you, the one poster, I believe it's in French, that shows the fur growing on the inside is the one that just no end of creeps me out. And I start getting, almost like I start.
There's a book you might want to check out called Body Criticism by Barbara Stafford.
Oh, really?
And it's all these medical illustrations from the 17th and early 18th century about the bizarre pseudosciences they believed. And you might really enjoy that.
That sounds like a lot of fun. And so I have to wonder about what hypothetically what it would feel like to be a werewolf.
Itchy?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, you did mention John the Baptist, right? He wore a hair shirt. So he had the hair on the inside and the skin on the outside.
Right.
I mean, even in heaven, right? He still has the hair shirt on in representation, like in Van Eyck's Skin Altarpiece, right? He's still.
So how can it be heaven if you're still itchy? Yeah.
Well, he's in constant penance, right? Even in glory, he's in constant penance.
Never thought about that. He definitely needs a new outfit. He needs a glorified.
Well, he gets his green cloak. I tell students, I'm like, you show up to a fancy restaurant and you don't have a sport coat, so they put the green cloak on him because he was so natural. It just went with everything.
Oh, natural for sure. Yeah, I mean, so I have to, just as far as Sartre and what the perception, it gets back to perception, right? And so
right.
If the skin, for instance, if the wolf hair is growing on the inside and is not actually perceptible to the viewer, there was one line of the paper that talked about how really most of the accounts are in agreement about the behavior of werewolves, not so much the appearance. And so I have to think that the behavior is more important than the appearance, certainly, particularly if the behavior is harmful. But it seems like for the Sartre episode of The Waiter that you're talking about, the appearance would matter more in a way.
Well, does it mean that the hair, if it's growing on the inside, is the subjugation of the penance that you're doing for blaspheming God?
I mean, yeah. I'm going to have to go back and reread my Sartre and think about that one. That's a conundrum.
Well, we'll all do that tonight. That'll be everybody's homework tonight.
All right.
Being in nothingness is about that thick. So.
Agreed.
Just a light one-off. You can polish it off in about a half hour.
No sleeping.
I want to thank you so much. I've thoroughly enjoyed this. I've been so tickled the entire time, particularly the fact that I sort of like was anticipating things, which makes me always happy because it means I'm understanding.
Excellent.
I want to thank everybody for tuning in. I'm going to invite you to take the survey that Juan is dropping into the various chats right now. I'm also going to invite you to tune in tomorrow night for the aforementioned Heather Green, who's going to talk to us about witchcraft on the small screen. And remind you, as always, stay spooky. Thank you so much. My notes are like I'm having my own transformation.
Yay! As long as you don't turn into the demon behind you.
Oh, Barong? Yeah, that would be toothy. I hope you enjoyed it too.
Oh yeah, definitely. That was a lot of fun. Thanks for the invitation.
Oh, my pleasure. This is truly fun, and I also had this written down too, just to throw out yet another philosopher to you. You mentioned Rousseau, and I was thinking about like the state of natural man in relationship to this too.
Uh-huh.
And is it returning you to some sort of like Adam and Eve-esque thing?
Well, yeah, because they're also wearing animal skins, if you think about it.
Well, I thought too about the idea of the night hag being Adam's first wife, who we call Lilith, and then just the relationship to Eve, because I had this whole theory about Eve being the first witch.
Well, and actually, don't you need to go back to Lilith, Adam's supposed first wife?
Yeah, but I was saying that in terms of like how she's structured, right? The story of Eve is very witchy.
Okay.
And also like her historical denigration up through the 19th century.
Certainly.
You ever seen the Stuck paintings of Eve?
I don't think so.
The most famous one is just called The Sin, and she looks like she's a 90s glam rocker with the serpent that's on her shirt. She's naked with the serpent that's on